Welcome to the wonderful world of the Czech Pirc, or Czech defense as it's sometimes called. This has to be one of the most fun openings to play as black, particularly if you like interesting and unusual positions where you can outplay your opponent. It's no wonder that if you look at the players that play it, over the years, you've got Mamedarov, Bolognian, got a lot of players that love these unusual positions. You've even got a lot of top-rated players that use it for blitz or for surprise weapons. So let's talk about what our ideas are and why we're going to play it. The Czech Pirc is one of my secret weapons, and I always love to use it in blitz and bullet, and I think my results speak for themselves. I've played it in thousands of games across multiple sites. Now, it also performs pretty well in Elite Chess, and is still played in the Masters database by players like Mamedarov, Bolognian. Now, if you're thinking that this is just going to be for blitz and bullet, I actually played the Czech Pirc this year in 2024 over the board in FIDE rated games, slow play, against an average rating opponent of 2220. We scored 3 out of 5. So that included a draw against the WGM and a win against the National Master. So the positions that I got out of the opening were pretty good. So, for example, against the WGM, they played bishop e3, and then after knight g4, we were completely fine. This is how we're going to set up our pieces in the majority of lines. We're going to play d6, knight f6, c6, queen a5, e5, bishop g4, and knight d7. This is remarkably effective and so difficult for white to get any sort of pressure against. So I'm going to be doing an entire playlist dedicated to the Czech Pirc. So this is the introduction video where I'm going to be showing you a relative overview of what you should be doing as black against the most popular replies. And then what I'll do is I'll have an entire playlist dedicated to the pawn structures, the strategies, the games, and all this sort of stuff. In general, you can get away, particularly in blitz and bullet, even to a really high level, just by knowing the general strategies of what to do against white's various responses. However, we're going to be going into depth within the playlist against each of white's 5 or 6 main tries, so that hopefully you can get positions that are not just equal, but if your opponent goes wrong, which, let's face it, they're pretty likely to do, because you're almost certainly going to know that the position is black better than white does, because how often do you really play against this move, c6? Probably pretty rare, right? And so let's try and win some games with the Czech Pirc. So here are my 5 main reasons why you should play the Czech Pirc. 1. Surprise factor. There are at least 10 different traps which, if white falls for, are going to just give you a free win. Now, what makes the Czech Pirc unique is that these traps have all been fallen to by grandmasters. So you've got players like John Ems and all these other top players. And if these grandmasters in slow play can fall for these traps, then you can be sure that your opponent in blitz and bullet especially will fall into them. And we can see in the Elite Chess database they often do. Reason 2, flexibility. So the Czech Pirc is characterized by this move c6. And this is just a really flexible move in the sense that we can, if we really want, we can play the Pirc still with g6, bishop g7. We can play more solid Philidor with e5. And we can even sort of go for a pawn storm on the queen side if we really want to as well. Essentially, there's about 4 or 5 different really interesting ideas that we can do. And if we're smart, we can essentially look at what white does and then react to our advantage. Reason 3, very little scope for exchanges. And so massive scope for winning and having a decisive result either way. What I mean by this is, in most of the openings, particularly, let's say, e4, e5, the King's Pawn opening, or even the Sicilian these days, you tend to find there's plenty of options for white to, if they really want to draw, They can force matters, they can swap lots of material, go into an ending, for example. With the Czech Pirc, you'll notice that there's no real way for white in any of the lines to force the queens off or to really exchange off lots of pieces, which means that I think if you're going for a win, Czech Pirc doesn't really allow for many quick draws from your opponent, and I think it's a good choice if you're going for the full point rather than allowing your opponent to get a draw. Reason number 4, massively underestimated. I can't think of very many decent books or courses or anything really on this opening, and that's despite it being fundamentally very sound and played by lots of strong players. The tendency with modern engines is to put a massive value on base. So for example, e4, e5 is massively popular in no small part due to engines favouring e5 above everything else. And your opponent is naturally going to be more booked up as white against e4, e5. But against c6, I've noticed a lot of players think that they've already got a one position, or they're in some way compelled to try and refute your opening right off the bat. But they don't realise that this is an opening that's been played by Kramnik. This is an opening that's been played by Mamedarov. It's a fundamentally sound opening. And so if your opponent underestimates your opening, that's really good. You'll really help your practical results. The last reason, apart from the obvious, that it's really fun to play, is that I think this fundamental soundness of the opening has been proven time again. And even though there are a couple of lines, particularly in f4, where the engine does think the white might get a slightest of edges, it's still fundamentally sound. And the structure with c6, d6, I think is very easy to play and relatively easy to master. And I think you'll have a lot of fun and win a lot of practical games in the opening. And it'll actually enrich your knowledge of chess, hopefully give you a weapon that you can have some fun with. To give you a flavour of how easy it is for white to go wrong here, one of the many traps that white can fall for, let's have a look at this game that over 4 different people have fallen for in the Masters database alone. So white here starts getting ultra aggressive. This knight, here we play knight a6, we're actually sacking this pawn. And here, black is actually losing really badly here. And as you can see, we look at these players in the Masters database. They include Grandmaster John Ems and 2475 player here. This is slow play games. So can you see the win here for black? 5. And it seems crazy, but if we look at the Lee Chess database, you can see a lot of players have fallen for this. So I've won this position as black before because white fell for this as well. So if players like John Ems can fall into this, Grandmasters, you can be sure that in Blitz and Billet your opponent could do the same thing. Because after f5, white is in a world of pain. Knight takes c2 is the threat. So the queen, if he moves back to f3, we're just going to take c2. We're just going to be a free rook on a1 up. And white can just resign basically then. So the move most white players are counting on here is en passant, then just bishop f5. And suddenly a lot of white players over the years and in Blitz and Billet realise that this pawn on c2, this queen defends this bishop, it's just completely lost really. A lot of your opponent might try something like f7, but we just take it. And we're just going to go knight takes c2 and take the rook on a1 afterwards. Be a free rook up. So that's a really easy and common mistake a lot of players in Blitz do, is they try and win this knight on e4. Then out of nowhere, pieces come flying out and we get a quick win. This is a counterblow type opening for black because we're going to, like a snake, spring into action depending on what white does with certain set motifs against each and every setup. So the most common reply on the Lee Chess database is going to be knight f3, which is significantly more popular than the most testing move f4. This is good. This is good for us. Because I think against knight f3, which is recommended by quite a few chessable courses and other places, Anish Giri recommends this in his e4 repertoire. But I think I've got a way here to, I think, get us quite a nice position. In fact, I think my results here after bishop g4 have been really good over the board, and in my own games at blitz and bullet. So yeah, I mean, I score 64% against bishop e2, which is the most common move, and yeah. And I think the reason why I score well, and I think most players score quite well in practice here, is we have quite a nice ready-made plan. You can see this is bishop g4 is the move favoured by Mamedarov in all his games. You can see here the top 4 games against Yifan and Nadit, Bakrot, Leko, all these top players. I think most masters play h3 here. I think their reasoning is to push g4 very early, but you'll tend to find very few players are going to do that over the board or in blitz, because bishop e2 is more natural. So most of your players are going to play this, and here what I want to suggest to do is this move. And yeah, I'm just going to play. See here, I play this a lot of times. Got 80% win rate against castle, which is good. And the main point is this is how Mamedarov plays it as well. You just play e5 basically. So castles, e5, and you know, I think we're doing absolutely fine here. Just got to play bishop e7, queen c7, castle. We basically just got an improved version of, I guess, Philidor, where the bishop's outside the pawn chain. And in practice, white is quite tricky for white to come up with a plan, because this bishop here isn't doing much. This bishop isn't doing too much. He kind of is going to have to try and play like knight e1, go for f4 or something. We have plenty of time to get counterplay, and I find I can often get wins quite easily, actually. Get things like queen b6 in later. I think we're absolutely fine here. So going back, let's go to h3 quickly. So I know that's the one. Look at the Masters database, even though it's the Masters database prefers this move. And here we have a choice. We can go back to h5, or we can just take off f3 immediately. I think both are fine. So bishop h5, and a lot of players are going to play on Lee chess. They're going to play g4 here. So bishop g6, of course. Now here, you can get a bit tactical with e5, or queen e2. But either way, I think black's absolutely fine here. Certainly don't think we have too much to worry about. So let's have a little look at Vidit v Svidler. h4 is played. It is h5. And yeah, I think we're completely fine here. I mean, it's complicated. We'll look more in depth at these lines in a future video. But yeah, nothing to worry about for sure. Now, one popular move that I found I've faced a lot of times is bishop e3 here. Essentially, they're playing for the traditional Pirc queen d2 castle queenside idea. So they're expecting g6, and then they'll play queen d2 or f3. Essentially, they just want to play. In practice, they're probably going to play this move f3, g4, h4 ideas. But thankfully, we have plenty of options here. The main move according to the database is queen a5, which makes sense. But personally speaking, I've done well just going for knight g4. So you can see score relatively okay. So here a lot of players are going to play the bishop c1 or bishop g5 or bishop f4. So they're going to do something with their bishop, because if they play like knight f3, we're just going to take this, and with a bishop pair we'll be absolutely fine. So let's say they have bishop g5. Now I play queen b6, and we got pressure on b2. We can play e5 next. So one little miniature that you can have against a careless opponent is you play this, and then queen takes f2, checkmate. So yeah, you can see it's happened a few times. But yeah, this is completely fine for black. We get plenty of play along this diagonal. We can even look at h6, g5, bishop g7. So I'll just show you what I mean. And this is get lovely pressure along here. Queen b6 coming. But personally, I think just play queen b6, say queen d2, and now e5 still. Takes, and this position, we're going to play bishop b4 probably. And I think we're doing absolutely fine. The only move that actually causes black any trouble is f4. Here we have queen a5. So the main point of queen a5 is we're going to pressurize e4 because of this pin, and we're going to play e5 against pretty much anything white does here. So let's say bishop d2, bishop d3, the main two moves. We can see in the Lee chess database, bishop d3 and bishop d2, the most common moves. So let's say bishop d3. It's the most common move. Now I play e5. So it's an interesting move e5 here, because a lot of players, when they see it, they immediately worry about the queen having to take back on e5 at the end. So they're worried that we're going to takes, and then have to go queen takes. But thankfully, we don't have to do that. So it's actually pretty good for us here. Takes. And if we look at engine, we're already doing completely fine. We're completely equal. I mean, I actually prefer black here, because we've got this lovely move, knight g4. So after knight g4, we have a huge amount of pressure on f2. And okay, so we can see black actually scores pretty well here. 56%, 75%. You know, essentially we're just going to we're going to go like bishop c5, knight d7, take on this pawn. And if we look at the game, knight f3 here, well, we could take here, but I'd be tempted to just go knight d7, but yeah. But black is completely fine. Let's say bishop c5, queen e2, and bishop check. We can see. So we can see that black is completely fine here. We can take on e5, we can go bishop c5, we can go bishop e7, we can go knight d7. So most of your opponents that won't go into this, because they'll see this and it's clearly not that great. So most players are going to play knight f3. Now here bishop g4 is the logical idea, just to pin here. And we can see already this position for white is already looking a little bit tricky. I mean, if we look at the engine, white's slightly better here. And this is meant to be the best line against the Pirc. I mean the Czech Pirc. Even though this is meant to be the best line against the Czech Pirc, I mean, I personally, even looking at it logically, there's so many little traps. You've got to be so careful. I mean, I'm not convinced about white here. Say bishop e3, knight d7, castle, and bishop e7. So I've had this position actually in quite a few games. We've got a really nice bishop outside the pawn chain, which we might even swap off. And we can just get our bishop out on e7, castle. So this is the main battleground, I think, for top grandmasters in this entire line. We can see Mamedarov has had this position as black quite a few times, including against top players like Grishuk, where he drew against. And yeah, I think if we look at the database, black is doing okay. Thank you so much for those of you that have stayed and watched the entire thing. Like I say, I'm going to be making multiple more videos on the Czech Pirc in a dedicated playlist. It'd really help me if you could subscribe if you like the content and comment on any thoughts you have about the opening. So thank you so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye.